Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the life and career of Kamala Harris. You've given us some pretty fascinating source material, and I'm really curious to see what we find.
Yeah, it's always interesting to kind of analyze someone who's, reached such heights in politics, especially when their path isn't always straightforward. And Kamala Harris's journey definitely seems to have some interesting twists and turns.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, from prosecutor to vice president, Harris's story is full of ambition and controversy. And there seem to be some contradictions, right? So let's start at the very beginning. Our source kind of paints a picture of her upbringing as this real blend of cultures. Born in Oakland to academics, then spending some time in high school in Canada, going to Howard University, and ultimately landing in San Francisco. It's interesting that she doesn't have any experience in the private sector. That's not typical, is it?
No, not really. Having spent her entire career in public service, her perspective is likely very much shaped by those experiences.
Mhm.
Definitely something to keep in mind.
For sure. And speaking of shaping experiences, our source goes into some detail about Harris's relationship with Willie Brown, a huge figure in San Francisco politics, especially during her early career. He was Speaker of the California Assembly and significantly older than her. It sounds like this connection was really important in getting her career off the ground. The source even mentions that Brown provided her with a BMW and helped her secure appointments to some pretty influential commissions.
The Speaker of the California Assembly is a really powerful position in state politics. No. They control the legislative agenda and have a lot of influence over appointments. So Brown's support would have definitely opened doors for Harris within San Francisco's political circles.
It sounds like San Francisco politics was all about who you knew, and our source even suggests that Brown helped Harris get a position in the San Francisco DA's office. Which, raises the question, how much of her early success was due to merit versus these kinds of connections?
Yeah, that's a big question, especially because the source also points out that there's no voting record for Harris until she was 29, which seems a little strange given that she portrays herself as, a lifelong activist. Kind of challenges the narrative she's built, don't you think?
It definitely raises some eyebrows. And then things get even more interesting when we get to the 2003 San Francisco District Attorney race. It seems like a really key moment in her career. Our source describes Harris as the underdog in the race. Initially, she was trailing behind her boss, Terrence Hallinan, and another candidate, Vic Fio. What I've found really fascinating is that the source suggests she ran a pretty aggressive campaign.
Yeah, I think understanding this context is going to be important, especially with the controversies surrounding that campaign. It'll help shed some light on how she operates under pressure.
The source alleges that Harris went over campaign finance limits by more than 3 times the amount she was allowed, and she accepted donations from landlords she was supposed to be regulating. It sounds like she was really willing to push the boundaries, doesn't it? And then there's the story about a misleading disclosure about these violations, printed in a tiny font on a door hanger, which some argue was designed to be overlooked by voters. Do you think that was a deliberate tactic?
Harris and her supporters have disputed these claims, but the fact remains, these allegations raise questions about how transparent and accountable she was early on in her political career. And I think that the misleading disclosure, regardless of intent, just adds to that perception.
Right, right. It certainly makes you wonder how far she was willing to go to win. But looking at the campaign itself, the source emphasizes how she presented herself as being tough on crime, while also maintaining this progressive image. It seems like a difficult balance to strike, especially in a city as liberal as San Francisco.
Oh, it's definitely a tightrope walk that many politicians attempt. The source also mentions that she criticized Hallinan for being soft on crime, but when you look at her record, it's not like she had this stellar track record when it came to prosecuting violent crimes herself. It's a tactic you see a lot in politics, trying to make your opponent look bad by focusing on their weaknesses and downplaying your own.
Yeah, it's all about controlling the narrative, right? And speaking of narratives, let's talk about the claim she's made about her experience as a prosecutor. Our source kind of suggests that she's maybe inflated her record a little bit, claiming to have tried hundreds of cases when the actual number was much lower. She's also touted this 90% conviction rate, but the source argues that we need to look a little closer at that figure.
Yeah, you can present statistics in many different ways to support whatever narrative you're trying to push. It's important to really dig into the methodology behind those claims to get a more complete picture, right? Like, were certain types of cases emphasized? Was there a focus on plea deals? These factors can have a big impact on that 90% figure.
So it might not be as impressive as it seems at first glance.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the drug lab scandal in San Francisco.
Yeah.
This is a big one. And it definitely raises questions about Harris's conduct as DA. The source says she knew about problems with the lab but was slow to act. This ultimately led to the dismissal of a lot of cases.
Yeah, it does make you wonder about her commitment to due process and ensuring that everyone gets a fair trial.
It was a serious ethical lapse that had real consequences for the justice system.
And it doesn't end there. The source also claims that she resisted releasing prisoners even though the courts had ordered it. She needed them for cheap labor to fight wildfires. And then there's the case of a Sikh man who was denied a job as a prison guard because of his religious attire, and Harris fought a long legal battle against his right to be employed.
Yeah, these cases present a pretty complicated view of her approach to criminal justice. It seems to contradict the image she's built for herself as a champion of civil rights. I think it's definitely something worth digging into a bit further.
Absolutely. And as we move into her time as Attorney General and then Senator, these contradictions seem to stick around. She focused on these high-profile consumer protection cases, which got her a lot of positive press, but she was also criticized by civil rights groups for her handling of wrongful convictions and prison overcrowding.
It seems like a pattern, right? Focusing on actions that will generate positive attention while potentially avoiding those more complex systemic issues.
Yeah, almost like she was picking her battles based on what would look best for her, and then her rise to the U.S. Senate. Our source makes the point that she had a pretty clear path within the Democratic Party, especially considering how hard it is for Republicans to win statewide office in California.
Yeah, that speaks to the political landscape in California. Democrats have a pretty strong advantage there. It definitely played a role in her rise.
So it seems like a bunch of factors came together to push her forward, her own ambition, the support of powerful figures like Willie Brown, and the structural advantages of being a Democrat in California. What do you make of all that?
It's an interesting mix, for sure. You have this individual drive, but also the maneuvering within the political system, and then the existing power dynamics at play. Makes you wonder how much agency any one person really has within such a complex system, right?
Right. It's not as simple as saying she was just lucky or that she was solely responsible for her own success.
Exactly. It was a whole bunch of things, and I think that complexity is important to keep in mind as we go deeper into Kamala Harris's life and career.
Definitely. Well said. And speaking of complex, our source then starts talking about Harris's personal life, in particular her marriage to Doug Emhoff, a high-powered attorney at a really prestigious law firm. And this is where things get particularly interesting.
Yeah, Emhoff's been accused of some pretty serious stuff, which, raises some red flags considering Harris's history of portraying herself as such a strong advocate for women and victims of domestic violence.
The source mentions accusations against Emhoff that include slapping a woman at the Cannes Film Festival and causing a woman to have a miscarriage through violence. It's pretty disturbing, and what's really surprising is that Harris has never commented on these allegations. It seems to go against everything she's said and done in the past about supporting women's rights and safety.
It definitely raises questions about whether she holds the people in her inner circle to the same standards that she holds others to. I mean, some people might say that her silence is a personal matter, but when you're in the public eye like she is, especially when you've built your reputation on advocating for certain values, the line between personal and political gets very blurry.
That's a good point. Her silence on these issues could be seen as betraying the principles she says she believes in. It also makes you think about her judgment and whether she's willing to hold powerful people accountable, even if it means going against her own interests or the interests of her allies.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just the allegations of violence either.
Yeah.
Our source describes Emhoff's behavior at his law firm as being objectifying toward women, creating a hostile work environment. And if that's true, it doesn't paint a very good picture of his attitude towards women, which makes Harris's silence even more difficult to understand.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing. There seems to be a real disconnect between her self-proclaimed feminism and the actions of her husband, or maybe it's her inaction in this case. And this ties into a larger point that our source makes, which is that it's really hard to pin down a consistent ideology or, clear set of beliefs for Harris. She's changed her position on a lot of issues throughout her career, like marijuana legalization, gun control, even the death penalty. But, someone like Bernie Sanders has remained pretty consistent in his views.
That's an interesting observation. I mean, some people would say that this flexibility is actually a good thing. Maybe it's a sign of pragmatism and ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to the realities of politics. And you hear that argument a lot. when politicians change their stance on issues over time.
So you're saying it could be seen as a positive.
Well, it depends. Others might say that all this shifting around means she doesn't really have core principles, that her views are based on what's politically convenient, rather than, a deep belief in something.
So is she a pragmatist or an opportunist? I guess that's something for each listener to decide.
Exactly. And I think that's a key takeaway from this whole deep dive. We're laying out the information, the different interpretations, but it's ultimately up to you to decide what you think.
All right, so let's shift gears back to Harris's record as a prosecutor. This seems to be where a lot of the most serious criticisms come up.
Yeah, her time as a prosecutor, both in San Francisco and later as Attorney General, it really gives us a window into how she approaches criminal justice. And it's an area that has sparked a lot of debate, for sure.
We've already talked about the drug lab scandal, which was a major ethical problem with some serious consequences. But our source goes on to detail other instances that raise some concerns about her dedication to due process, fairness and protecting the rights of the accused.
These cases present a bit of a mixed bag, honestly. On one hand, she's gotten praise for her work on consumer protection, advocating for victims of fraud and things like predatory lending. But on the other hand, we have these accusations about her conduct as a prosecutor that are, pretty concerning.
Like the claim that she refused to release prisoners even though a court had ordered it because she needed them for cheap labor to fight wildfires.
Yeah, that's a particularly disturbing one, right?
Yeah.
It implies that she was willing to exploit vulnerable people for political gain. It makes you question what her priorities really are and whether she truly values the rights of all citizens equally.
Our source also mentions a case where she fought to keep a conviction in place, even though there was strong evidence that the person might have been wrongfully imprisoned. It seems like she was more interested in protecting her conviction rate than in making sure justice was actually served.
And that perception is further fueled by accusations that she focused on what they call slam dunk cases that would guarantee good headlines, while neglecting the more complex cases that might have forced her to challenge the status quo or admit that mistakes were made.
It makes you wonder if she was really focused on serving the people or if it was more about advancing her own career.
And it brings us back to that tension we talked about before, right? Between rhetoric and reality. Her actions as a prosecutor don't always align with the image she projects as this champion of justice and equality.
Yeah, that's a big contradiction. And our source even alleges that she had a pattern of being lenient towards certain types of criminals, people with connections to powerful figures, or illegal immigrants, while aggressively going after others who, didn't have any political influence.
If that's true, that's a serious breach of public trust. The justice system is supposed to be blind, to social status or political connections. Everyone deserves to be treated equally under the law.
Absolutely. And that kind of selective justice undermines the very idea of a fair and impartial legal system. It makes people lose faith in our institutions, and it creates this climate of, cynicism and distrust.
It brings us to another concern that our source highlights, and that's Harris's stance on free speech. It's a topic that's become increasingly controversial in recent years, and her views on this are particularly relevant given the growing power of tech companies and, the potential for the government to overreach in the digital space.
Are you talking about the case of David Dalen, the journalist who went undercover to expose Planned Parenthood's alleged involvement in selling fetal tissue?
Exactly. That case is often brought up by people who criticize Harris's record on free speech. Our source claims that she pursued the first ever prosecution of a journalist in California history in this instance, basically ignoring First Amendment protections to protect a powerful political ally.
So it sounds like a case of political convenience trumping constitutional rights.
It's definitely a controversial episode in her career, and it raises some big questions about how committed she really is to free speech, especially when it comes to viewpoints she might disagree with.
Yeah, you have to wonder about her tolerance for dissent and her willingness to use the power of the government to silence people who challenge her or her allies.
And it gets even more concerning when you consider her statements about the need for censorship on social media. Our source says she believes that certain viewpoints are too dangerous to be allowed, even if they're true.
It's a slippery slope, isn't it? Who gets to decide what's acceptable speech and what isn't? Where do we draw the line?
Those are big questions, and they're questions that we as a society really need to be thinking about. The First Amendment protects even unpopular speech, and any attempt to limit that, especially by those in power, should be met with a lot of skepticism and scrutiny.
That idea of censorship, of controlling information, it connects back to this theme of potential abuse of power that we've been talking about throughout this whole deep dive. It seems to be a recurring pattern in Harris's record, and it's something we need to be very aware of as we try to determine if she's fit for higher office.
It's a good reminder that power, if it's not kept in check, can be used to silence people, to manipulate what we believe, and to undermine the very principles of a free and open society.
So where do we go from here? We've explored some pretty heavy stuff in this deep dive into Kamala Harris's record. It's a lot to take in, and I imagine our listeners are probably trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that these are just allegations from a single source. It's up to each listener to decide how credible they think this source is and to do their own research, to come to their own conclusions.
Absolutely. Our goal here is to provide you with information and to show you the different ways this information can be interpreted so that you can make a more informed judgment.
And to get you thinking critically, to get you engaged with the political process. It's really important that we as citizens hold our leaders accountable, regardless of their political party.
Well said. In part two of our deep dive, we're going to explore some of the potential implications of a Harris presidency based on the information we've uncovered. We'll look at her record on things like criminal justice, censorship, corporate influence, and see if her past actions can tell us anything about what kind of decisions she might make in the future.
It's a really important conversation to have because the stakes are high. The choices we make in the voting booth have very real consequences.
Stay tuned for part two of our deep dive into Kamala Harris.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the life and career of Kamala Harris. In part one, we explored her background, her rise to power, and some of the controversies that have followed her. Now we're going to take a closer look at a few specific aspects of her record that raise some important questions about her suitability for higher office.
Yeah, we left off talking about identity politics and the allegations surrounding Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff. I think it's important to unpack these issues further, as they offer a window into her character, her judgment, and, potential vulnerabilities as a leader.
I agree. Let's start with the allegations against Emhoff, which are pretty serious. Our source details multiple accusations, including an incident at the Cannes Film Festival where he allegedly slapped a woman, and another incident where he's accused of causing a woman to miscarry through violence.
It is disturbing stuff, and what's particularly striking is Harris's silence on these allegations. It seems to contradict her, history of advocating for women and victims of domestic abuse.
It does raise questions about whether she applies the same standards of accountability to those in her inner circle as she does to others. I mean, some might argue that her silence is a personal matter. But when you're a public figure, especially one who has built a platform on advocating for certain values, the lines between personal and political become blurred.
Yeah, that's a good point. Her silence could be interpreted as a betrayal of the very principles she claims to uphold it. Also makes you wonder about her judgment and whether she's willing to hold powerful individuals accountable, even if it means going against her own interests or those of her allies.
Exactly. And it's not just the allegations of violence. Our source also describes Emhoff's behavior at his law firm as objectifying towards women, creating a hostile work environment, if true. This paints a troubling picture of his attitude towards women, which further complicates Harris's silence.
Yeah. It certainly adds another layer to the discussion, and it seems like there's a disconnect between her self-proclaimed feminism and the actions or inaction of her husband, and this ties into a broader pattern. Our source identifies a difficulty in pinning down a consistent ideology or set of beliefs for Harris. She's changed positions on several issues throughout her career, from marijuana legalization to gun control to the death penalty.
This lack of consistency can be viewed in different ways. Some might see it as a sign of pragmatism and ability to adapt to changing circumstances and political realities. It's a common argument for politicians who evolve on issues over time.
So you're saying it could be seen as a positive trait?
It depends on your perspective. Others might view this shifting of positions as a lack of core principles, suggesting that her views are shaped more by political expediency than by deep-seated conviction.
So is she a pragmatist or an opportunist? I guess that's for each listener to decide.
Precisely, and I think that's a key takeaway from this deep dive. We're presenting you with the information and the different interpretations, but ultimately it's up to you to form your own conclusions.
Okay, so let's shift our focus back to Harris's record as a prosecutor, as this seems to be where some of the most serious criticisms arise.
Her time as a prosecutor in San Francisco and later as Attorney General provides a window into her approach to criminal justice, and it's an aspect of her career that has generated considerable debate.
We've already talked about the drug lab scandal, which was a major ethical lapse with serious consequences, but our source details other instances that raise concerns about her commitment to due process fairness and the rights of the accused.
These cases paint a complex picture. On one hand, she's been praised for her work on consumer protection, advocating for victims of fraud and predatory lending. But on the other hand, there are these troubling allegations about her conduct as a prosecutor.
Like the allegation that she resisted releasing prisoners despite court orders because she needed them for cheap labor to fight wildfires.
Yes, that's a particularly disturbing accusation, as it suggests a willingness to exploit vulnerable individuals for political gain. It raises questions about her priorities and whether she truly values the rights of all citizens.
Our source also mentions a case where she fought to uphold a conviction despite compelling evidence that the person might have been wrongfully imprisoned. It seems like she was more concerned with protecting her conviction rate than ensuring justice was served.
That perception is further fueled by accusations that she prioritized slam-dunk cases that would generate positive headlines while neglecting more complex cases that might require challenging the status quo or admitting mistakes.
It makes you wonder if she was truly interested in serving the people or more concerned with advancing her own career.
And this brings us back to that tension between rhetoric and reality that we discussed earlier. Her actions as a prosecutor don't always align with the image she projects as a champion of justice and equality.
It's a significant contradiction. Our source also alleges a pattern of leniency towards certain types of criminals, like those connected to powerful figures or illegal aliens, while aggressively prosecuting others who lacked political clout.
If true, that would be a serious breach of public trust. The justice system should be blind to social status or political connections. Everyone deserves equal treatment under the law.
Absolutely. And this kind of selective justice undermines the very foundation of a fair and impartial legal system. It erodes faith in our institutions and creates a climate of cynicism and distrust.
And this brings us to another area of concern, highlighted by our source, Harris's stance on free speech. It's a topic that has become increasingly contentious in recent years, and her views are particularly relevant given the growing power of tech companies and the potential for government overreach in the digital sphere.
You're referring to the case of David Daleiden, the journalist who went undercover to expose Planned Parenthood's alleged involvement in the illegal sale of fetal tissue.
Yes, that case is often cited by those who criticize Harris's record on free speech. Our source claims she pursued the first prosecution of a journalist in California history, in this instance ignoring First Amendment protections to protect a powerful political ally.
It sounds like a case of political expediency trumping constitutional rights.
It's certainly a controversial episode in her career, and it raises questions about her commitment to free speech, particularly when it comes to viewpoints she might disagree with.
It does make you wonder about her tolerance for dissent and her willingness to use the power of government to silence those who challenge her or her allies.
And it becomes even more concerning when you consider her statements about the need for censorship on social media. Our source claims she believes certain viewpoints are too dangerous to be allowed, even if they're true.
It's a slippery slope, isn't it? Who gets to decide what's acceptable speech and what's not? Where do we draw the line?
Those are crucial questions that we as a society need to grapple with. The First Amendment protects even unpopular speech, and any attempt to restrict it, especially by those in power, should be met with skepticism and scrutiny.
This idea of censorship and control over information ties back to the potential for abuse of power that we've been discussing throughout this deep dive. It's a recurring theme in Harris's record, and it's something we need to be mindful of as we evaluate her fitness for higher office.
It's a reminder that power, if unchecked, can be used to silence dissent, manipulate narratives, and undermine the very principles of a free and open society.
So where do we go from here? We've explored some pretty dark territory in this deep dive into Kamala Harris's record. It's a lot to absorb, and I'm sure our listeners are processing all of this information.
It's important to remember that these are allegations from a single source. It's up to each listener to evaluate the credibility of this source and do their own research to form their own opinions.
Absolutely. Our goal is to provide you with information and diverse perspectives so you can make an informed judgment.
And to encourage critical thinking and engagement with the political process, it's crucial that we as citizens hold our leaders accountable regardless of their political affiliations.
Well said. In part 3 of our deep dive, we'll explore some potential implications of a Harris presidency based on the information we've gathered. We'll examine her record on issues like criminal justice, censorship, and corporate influence, and consider what her past actions might tell us about her future decisions.
It's a crucial conversation to have. As the stakes are high, The choices we make in the voting booth have real-world consequences.
Stay tuned for part 3 of our deep dive into Kamala Harris. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the life and career of Kamala Harris. We've gone through her past, looked at both her accomplishments and the controversies, and I think it's safe to say we've uncovered a complex and sometimes contradictory record, right?
Yeah, to say the least, it's been fascinating. I mean, we've seen how her ambition, her political maneuvering, and, her approach to criminal justice have really shaped her path.
Exactly. And now in this last part, I think we need to look ahead. What could a potential Harris presidency look like based on what we've learned so far?
It's the big question, isn't it? And as we're heading into this election, it's definitely something voters should be thinking about.
Our source paints a pretty concerning picture, actually, especially when it comes to her record on criminal justice. They argue that her past actions suggest, maybe a disregard for due process, a willingness to put winning ahead of fairness.
That's a serious accusation for sure, and it's
Mm.
something voters should definitely consider. I mean, if those patterns were to continue, a Harris presidency could lead to even more people in prison. A bigger gap between races in the justice system and even further erosion of our civil liberties.
Yeah. It's a scary thought, and we can't forget those allegations of selective justice, where certain people or groups get treated differently by the law just because of their connections or their status.
Yeah, that's a two-tiered system, right? And it undermines the whole idea of a fair and just society. People lose trust in the system. It creates fear, resentment.
Right.
It's like the opposite of what a president should be aiming for.
Our source also expresses some serious concerns about Harris's views on censorship, especially online. We talked about the David Daleiden case, where she's accused of going after a journalist to protect the political ally, and then her statements about the need for more control over what people can say online.
Yeah, her actions and her words in this area suggest she might be willing to restrict free speech, even if it means, sacrificing those constitutional rights for political gain.
So if that were to continue under her presidency, we could see a real chilling effect on public discourse, right? Dissenting voices get silenced, alternative viewpoints get suppressed.
It's a slippery slope, towards authoritarianism,
Mm.
and it's a dangerous path for any democracy.
Absolutely.
think
The
it
freedom
is.
to express ourselves, even if our views are unpopular or challenge the status quo, that's essential for a healthy society.
Yes, what separates a free society from an oppressive one, right?
And beyond these specific concerns, our source also talks about the possibility of increased corporate influence on the government if Harris were to become president.
Right. They point to her history of, being close with powerful corporations and suggest that she might be more likely to prioritize their interests over the interests of regular citizens.
Yeah, and that's a valid concern. It's a problem that's deeply rooted in our political system. I mean, the influence of money in politics is undeniable, and it often leads to policies that benefit the wealthy and powerful at the expense of the working class and marginalized communities.
It's a pattern we've seen over and over again.
So, if Harris were to become president, we might see a continuation of policies that favor those corporate interests. Things like deregulation tax breaks for the wealthy, cuts to social programs.
It's a possibility,
Ah.
and it's one that voters need to think about.
Yeah.
Do her past actions show a willingness to challenge corporate power, or do they show a tendency to side with those who already have the money and the influence?
It's a question that requires, really looking closely at her record and her campaign promises. So after this deep dive into Kamala Harris's life and career, what are your final thoughts? What really stands out to you?
I think what strikes me most is this constant tension between her public image, the one that's been so carefully crafted, and the reality of her actions. We've seen how she presents herself as this progressive champion of justice and equality,
Mhm.
but her record doesn't always match up.
It's a good reminder that we can't just take politicians at their word, right?
Mm.
We have to look beyond what they say, scrutinize what they do, hold them accountable for their choices.
This deep dive has given you a lot of information to think about as you head into this election. We've explored the good and the bad of Kamala Harris's, past the controversies and the potential implications of her presidency. But in the end, it's up to you, the listener, to decide what it all means.
Yeah, we've laid out the facts, the analysis, the different perspectives. Now it's your turn to weigh the evidence, consider the consequences, and make a choice that reflects your own values and your vision for America.
Yeah, informed citizenship means being actively engaged, thinking critically, and being willing to question those who want to lead us.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you something to think about and, empowered you to make informed decisions. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.